I also would like to address 3 points. First, what is the new Russian middle class? I mean, we all know that what we vaguely call the opposition that we've seen in the streets of Moscow and other cities has 3 components. One is a red component that's largely older, looking back on the Soviet experience. There is also a disturbingly large brown component, reflective of rather xenophobic nationalist ideas that is largely based on the urban male younger labor force, what one might call the proletariat. But then there is this new middle class that has attracted so much attention. First, I think we have to recognize that this new middle class does not represent the middle of Russia. Russia is still predominantly a working class society. When we talk about the new Russian middle class, what we're talking about is people who have lifestyles comparable to the European middle class. That's not a majority, it's not a plurality, it's a minority. It's a new prosperous class of people who have incomes and lifestyles, but for the most part, no wealth, which is to say they have lifestyles that are potentially insecure, as they learned painfully during the recent economic difficulties. Now, these are also people who are comparable to the European middle class in attitudes and expectations. And that is something very new and different in Russia. These are people who are urban, they are educated, they are white collar, but these are also, unusually in Russian history, particularly for those of us who lived in the old Soviet Union, as Jim and I both did, these are people who have traveled extensively outside of their own country. These are people who have foreign languages, and not just English. And these are people who are very digitally connected. These are people who are part of a very cosmopolitan middle class worldwide. These are people that I would characterize with a fairly simplistic term. I would call them modern. And modernity is a very delicate process to introduce into a society that has political structures which are very resistant to the modern. Now, Medvedev and Putin have talked about the need for modernization, and I have no doubt they're very serious about this. But understanding how to bring about modernity in a society which is still laboring under the legacies of the 7 decades of the Soviet period and what preceded it is a very challenging process. I recall that when President Medvedev was in Silicon Valley during his visit to California, one of the young Russian engineers there asked him whether he understood that Silicon Valley is not a place. It's a state of mind. What that represents, whatever else Silicon Valley may be, it's a part of civil society. And that it reflects, I think more broadly, that this new Russian middle class, in its own concept of itself, thinks of itself as being civil society. Now, because it is not a majority, it is not leading, it does not speak for Russia. What it does do is it plays a terribly important catalytic role, not just politically, but in terms of economic development, technology, cultural. Broad political culture is where this new middle class is at the cutting edge. They do not, however, have very much by way of organization. They really know what they don't want, which is to say they would like the next 12 years not to be a repetition of the preceding 12 years. But beyond that, they are somewhat inchoate and unformed. Which brings me to my second point, which is political structures. The real loser in the electoral process has been the party of power, United Russia, which couldn't even get a majority of votes even with ballot box stuffing in December. Now, parties of power are a very reliable and traditional part of the Russian political tradition. And even since the end of the Soviet Union, there have been a series of efforts to create an effective party of power, and they have all failed. I take it that United Russia, as an effective party of power, has failed. And that raises some big questions. What will replace it? What will Mr. Putin seek to create as an effective party of power? Because this is not just about the Duma in Moscow. This is about the whole web of political power throughout this vast country. And Russia is very much a patchwork of how political power is executed. And it requires structures. But the new middle class also require political structures, and they don't have them. I mean, if there's anything that's clear, is it's not just united Russia whose day is past. But if you look at people like Zyuganov and Zhirinovsky and Yavlinsky, these guys were tired, washed-up political faces when Putin first came on the political stage. What Russia desperately needs is some new faces, and it has some. Some of them may not be political faces we're going to be terribly happy with as time goes on, but it needs more of them, and it needs political faces that operate beyond the blogosphere in structures. Now, one thing is clear is that the government, the power elite, have the ability to recreate structures like a party of power, making them effective and making them legitimate and acceptable in localities and regions throughout Russia is becoming, I think, a very, very challenging task. People do not take it on faith that these organizations have legitimacy. When it was a question of people relying on money from the center to pay pensions, to pay salaries, to keep local hospitals open, to keep the whole structure of local life, particularly in the hundreds of so-called monogorody throughout Russia, that was one thing. That's a dependency relationship upon an institution that can deliver. Increasingly, that is going to come into question. Not only its ability to deliver, but its legitimacy in the eyes of local people, particularly given the pervasiveness of corruption. The third point I'd like to address is perhaps a bit more controversial, and it's what I will characterize as the demonization of Vladimir Putin, both abroad, meaning in this country particularly, but in Russia itself, among many members of this new Russian middle class. In my view, this is not only unjustified, it's very short-sighted, and it potentially leads into some very dangerous dead ends. Now, I would be the first to criticize, in fact, I have criticized in a number of venues, Mr. Putin for what I consider to be serious failures in the development of the rule of law and in the terrible development of corruption in Russia. But this is not a Russian Mobutu Sese Seko. This is a very intelligent, very dedicated, very patriotic individual who cares deeply about his legacy to his country. When he campaigned under the motto Dostroika, completion, fulfillment, I take him entirely at his word. He believes that he has, in the last dozen years, laid the groundwork for the creation of a modern 21st century Russia, and he only needs the time to fulfill that. He has spoken often of the failed legacy of Stolypin in the early part of the previous century, and his belief that if Stolypin, an authoritarian reformer, had had more time and adequate authority, that Russia in the 20th century could have had a very different and very better history, and that he sees his legacy as assuring that Russia in the 21st century has a modern and positive history that will be seen as his legacy. Now, I happen to think that his vision of what that modern Russia would be like is a flawed one and an unrealizable one, and I think the techniques and the methods he has in mind to bring it about are flawed and unrealizable. But that doesn't mean he doesn't take it seriously. The dilemma is, of course, that you can't have modernization without modern people. And the modern people in Russia are increasingly people who are frustrated with the political culture and the political system, and they are mobile. They have the capacity to lead. And in fact, in recent years, have been doing so in rather alarming numbers. I've heard some reports that indicate that a number of people, young people in particular, who had been intending to leave the country, decided to stick around when they began to see some on-the-street civil society and opposition to the system. I think it's going to be very, very important how the new political system in its early months deals with this changing political environment as to whether or not it forces abroad precisely those people who are absolutely essential to the development of any kind of a modern economy, let alone a modern political culture in Russia. I think the outcome of this process is very much in question. But I would recommend to many of these people who are describing Putin in terms of great vilification that they should be very careful. The notion that Putin is going to end up at the Hague Tribunal is just not on. This is not a man who is going to let himself and his entire political elite, because he represents a very large structure of power, be defeated in that kind of way. Unfortunately, Russia does not have what I would call a Colombey les deux églises alternative, which is, I'm old enough to remember when Charles de Gaulle was vilified on the streets of Paris, every bit as much as Putin has been, but he could sort of, put up his nose and turn his back and walk away to his hometown and live in comfort and safety for the rest of his life. That is not currently an option in Russia. In some ways, the man who has the greatest victim of the lack of rule of law in Russia is Putin himself, because he's at the top of this very slippery pole, and he doesn't have too many alternatives but to stay there. And I think the people who are looking toward creating real political reform in Russia need to start thinking very seriously about how you create an alternative, something in between The Hague and Colombey, because the notion that somehow an absolutist policy of a Russia without Putin is going to succeed is not going to happen. Indeed, it could lead to something even worse, because the powers that rule Russia, not just one man, but the very broad numbers of people who rule Russia, seems to me are quite capable of forging an alliance with this broad nationalistic brown proletarian nature of the society, who also are affected by migration, but by in-migration from people from Central Asia and the Caucasus and Moldova, who they see as challenging their jobs and their lifestyles. And I think an environment in which the new Russian middle class create a political struggle in which they are unwilling to compromise or to find common ground with the people who rule Russia, potentially creates an alternative in which not only the new Russian middle class could be losers, but Russia as a whole could be a loser. And that would be bad not just for that country, but for all of Russia's neighborhood. And we're all in that neighborhood.